We're here today with Ben Fry, who is the principal at Fathom Design and an alum of the MIT Media Lab as part of our course on information design. And Ben, you've kind of invented a role that didn't exist just a few years ago. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do and how you got there?
So the thing that I've been doing for the last 6 years is running a company that's all about how do we actually do design and work with data, and but do that within the medium of code. So using computation, building visual interfaces, building ways of working with and thinking about data, navigating through it, things like that. And prior to that, I was doing that as first as a graduate student and researcher, and then also working individually, and essentially got to a point where I wanted to work on projects of a larger scope, and to be able to get more breadth out of it, and have other collaborators that I could work with to really do things at a larger scale.
And you've now got more than a dozen people that you work with, and you've worked everybody from news outlets to biology data to music, all sorts of stuff.
So and part of the fun is jumping between those different domains. So like one of the things that first or that most attracted me to design, that I really love about design, is this idea of kind of taking any thing that you're curious about and sort of making that into a work. And so that's it becomes a project. It becomes a that you have some curiosity. You want to go dig that out and explain it, unpack it, learn a little bit more about it. Really immerse yourself in a domain. And so a lot of times when we're finding, or as much as possible when we're looking at client projects, we want to take things that have an interesting, domain that we're that we're curious about, and that we really want to spend some time thinking about and learning more about.
So can you take us through one of your projects? And
Sure.
I bet a lot of students will be interested in what's the process that you go through. How do you go from a client walks in to one of the glossy things that you end up with?
So I'll show this No Ceilings project. So the idea behind the No Ceilings project was that we were contacted by the Clinton Foundation and Gates Foundation, and that they were doing an effort to look at the progress of women and girls over the last 20 years. And can we look at this across a number of as many different indicators as possible, as many countries as possible, and just see where have things improved? Where do we have data? Where do we not have data? Where are there gaps that really need to be understood? And so they want, and really to have this data-driven approach to kind of elevate the conversation about these issues. And so even with just that as a very broad kind of thing, and they didn't know exactly what that that they were looking for a visualization, and that it was kind of as if it's sort of this one monolithic kind of thing. And so again, sort of the interesting thing for us is to be able to take a brief like that and say, okay, how do we take and then an enormous spreadsheet that we received that has just hundreds of thousands of rows of data. How do we map that into, how do we tell this story about the last couple decades, and be able to pull a couple of interesting stories out of that and humanize what's actually happening in that data. So the No Ceiling site that we have here, up at the top we have an initial visualization that's looking at the gender gap in workforce participation. So with moving left to right, these are each one of these lines is a country. The aqua or blue dots at the top, those are that's percentage of men in the labor force. The orange dot at the bottom is the percentage of women labor force, and then each line is one country, as I was saying. So I can drag the mouse and just kind of scrub through here and see, so here we have within Albania, 65% of men are in the labor force and 45% of women. And we can also play this back as far as going back to 1995, and now we're moving from 1995 to 2012. So, back to this idea of, what's improved. So we're seeing some progress here as far as closing that workforce gap, but it's still not a really drastic or significant change, but we can also organize by highest to lowest workforce participation for men, or the same for women, and just see how that coalesces over that almost 20-year period. And so, this is an example of there's progress, but not enough, and be able to let people dive into that a little bit to learn more about the issue.
It's amazing how much you get on one screen. That what I love about your work is that it takes something that before would have been either impossible to comprehend or would have taken an enormous amount of time, and now just in 30 seconds in your web browser, you can get a feel for this.
Yeah, and that is one of the things we really struggle with. So it's nice to hear that, but that's also one of the things that we spend an enormous amount of time on is what's the right amount of information to actually put on a single screen, and that's driven by factors like what kind of screen will people be using. So this particular representation actually was driven by our showing the project in as an installation, so showing it on a big touch screen, and so we wanted something that people could that looked compelling at a distance, and that people could come up to and start tapping on it and start getting more out of it. But for instance, the mobile version, so the version of this that runs on a phone, is very different. We pick a much smaller subset of countries and try and tell just the core of the story without really getting into, just the just what a range of countries there are and things like that. So just but suffice to say, it's one of the main things that that we struggle with and think about is what's the right amount of information to have on any one screen, and how do you avoid people, like what's the right balance between it being compelling to look at, but also not just overwhelming people with, just a sea of dots and numbers and things.
Speaking of that, what are some common mistakes that you find yourself making, or that you sometimes see because the path is not straightforward?
Yeah. So I think one of the there are a couple things. I think a lot of it focuses around trying to make things that are just really simple. So as far as getting started with any of this, really important to just say what's the simplest possible way to show my point. Like one of the things I often find that other fields actually have really useful ways of talking about these things. So one of the things from film, sort of like one school of film, is really about what can you take away from a shot, or what can you take away from what's happening to just focus on exactly what the story is and exactly what that narrative is. And so in the case of the that visualization that just shows the gaps, we're not showing the geography of all these countries because it's not telling you something very compelling. We're not showing, with the missing data or some of these other details that we get into. And so it's really just figuring out what can we take away from that representation. The simplicity in terms of that story is important, but the same thing happens as far as visually what you put into it. So you can almost always just keep subtracting things back. Edward Tufte has all these books about doing really that design portion of it, and he likes talking about data ink and sort of removing things. And I think it's important to think about how to what is the simplest possible way of showing a message, and then you can dial it up or down based on that, or you can add more detail once you have your your core message actually out there and working.
How can people who are excited about doing work like this get started? Like when you have a project, what are the first questions that you ask about data? I'm imagining for your UN project, I'm imagining for your global initiative project that like Bill Clinton emails you a spreadsheet and he says, right. What's in here?
Yeah, please help us figure this out. It's a lot of times we're just looking at what are what's a way to get started with some of it? So we use tools like Excel, or we might use something like Python, or the people who did the initial data collection had been using Tableau. We found that Tableau was kind of creaking under the weight of how much was in there. So we wound up building some of our own tools. Typically, we build a lot of our own tools to look at the data in different ways. But the thing we're looking for is, let's try and see what the data looks like as quickly as possible. Let's put it on a map. Let's plot it out. Let's see if there's anything interesting starting to emerge, even just from the simplest possible representation of it, and that might give us a thread. And then from there, working through to what are different stories that we might be able to pull out of it. So, and sometimes the the story's not there. So with the no ceilings work, for instance, there's 850,000 data points, but on the site we maybe cover in the thousands at best. And so that's not to say that the rest of it is all garbage, but it's we can really only kind of scratch the surface, even amongst a host of a dozen different interactive visualizations of it and things like that. And we did a process of we went through and found 24 different stories and sort of did sketch versions of just here's what this looks like on a bar chart, and there's something interesting happening in a regional setting that we can see on this map, or here's something that's changing over time that's compelling. And so we take those stories and we do some internal editing to say this one's more interesting or less interesting, or this is something that we could tell in a really compelling way visually, or let's merge these two stories together. And then we go back to the work with the clients, and they say, we'd love to do this story because we'd really like to elevate this, and can you add this other? Actually, in this case, we did a lot of adding other data because they wanted, this data set reminds me of this other policy stuff we found, so let's actually roll that in as well to kind of strengthen the story, or things that just weren't priorities that would be too much of a distraction from sort of other efforts that we were doing.
So it's not even a question of you've got the data, what's the right picture?
Right.
It's make lots of different prototypes about different aspects of it.
Yes.
And when you need to, pull in other things.
Yeah. So and so what I try to do, and what we try and do in the studio, is to really sketch with the data. To really do a lot of those in as many prototypes as possible, as quickly as possible, and and in as simple a way as as quickly as possible, and in as simple a way as we can. So if it's a chart that we can make with Excel, then great. And we'll just make it with Excel. If it's something that actually needs some code or needs something more custom, we can build something out like that instead. But getting that initial deck, and that there's a lot of that that back and forth as far as prioritization and all the different factors that are involved in that, or a lot of things we have to leave out because, well, we just we don't feel great about how the robustness of this data, or there are too many gaps, or there are too many countries that aren't represented. So we don't want to do a particular visualization when we only have data for these 6 countries, because it feels like we're picking on those 6 countries, and it's like, well, where's the U.S.? And it's like, we don't have data. But anybody visiting the site doesn't understand the idea of you don't have the data for the U.S. It just looks like that editorial decision carries significant weight, and and with good reason. And so that winds up playing a role as well.
What tools do you recommend that people try? You've mentioned spreadsheet tools a number of times.
Sure.
That's a great way to make pictures with data. What are some other entry-level ways that people can create data graphics
get up
and
running,
information design?
So so I mentioned things like Excel and OpenOffice that we use a bunch. Also doing if you're going to get into the code thing, one of the other projects I'm involved in, the processing project, that's a good way of that I use that for a lot of my own work in terms of how we build things. We use it in the studio a great deal to prototype and work with large data sets. There's also tools like D3 that are really focused on how do you, here are a couple different methods for visualization, and you can kind of get data up and running with it, and it's native to the web, and that's a really great way to get things up and running, and sharing with other people. And there are other various tools out and online, but that's a range of things, I suppose.
Cool. I like you're involved with processing. Ben is one of the co-founders of Processing and has been a key force there for north of a decade.
Yeah.
The last question I wanted to ask is, if you got to offer one design assignment to the world where you saw all sorts of people online doing different projects, what is your design assignment for the world? Dear Planet Earth.
No, and I've been struggling with this because I'm getting ready to teach a course for undergrads in 2 weeks, and really struggling with what is that first assignment. I think the thing that I am always trying to do when getting people up and running with this is really getting them to think about a data set that they're interested in or curious about, and so the sooner that you can find, here's whether it's, the no ceilings data or some other, data set that you found online or something like that. You really want to have something that you are personally curious about and invested in and want to do something with it, because that curiosity will show through in the final outcome. I did a course a couple years ago with my friend Golan Levin, and we said you can't do any projects about the weather, because if you're going to do the weather, look out the window. Or if you want to know what the weather's like, look out the window. And you can't do anything with the stock market because you're students and you don't care about the stock market. But that's kind of one of the that those are kind of the two default go-to kind of things. And and I had a student a couple years ago who, he's working with stock market data, and it's you don't care about the stock market. And he's like, yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of interesting. And so, we kind of went around about that for a couple weeks, and finally he found a set of probabilities for opening hands for Texas Hold'em poker, and totally just ran with that in a way that he had not done the entire semester, but built a whole visualization around that. But his whole his entire interest in that and trying to understand what was in there, and his own personal wanting to explain that to other people and show that to his friends, talk about what that actually meant as far as opening hands. It completely changes the perspective of what that thing you're creating. And so it's like anything, as far as it's like writing. You want to write about the thing that you're passionate about. And so and with that, so the other side of that is find something that's as simple as possible. So if it's 10 data, start with 10 data points, start with 20 data points, just get a representation up, and then start, figuring out how you might, move it along further. So.
Awesome. Thanks so much for taking the time.
You.
You can learn more about Ben's work on the Fathom Design website.
Yeah, fathom.info.
Great. Thanks for joining us.